Hi, this is Adam. This is another Eye on North Carolina blog. We are here in Burlington, North Carolina at the Alamance Battleground. It's a very historic site. In 1771, the local settlers fought the War of Regulation against Governor Tryon, and they were protesting taxes and other freedoms that were taken away from them. And we are here with site manager Bryan, who's going to tell us more about the history and all the things that have occurred at the battleground.
Well, this is Alamance Battleground State Historic Site. Right now we have 41.5 acres, of which about half of those actually involve the original battlefield. We have battle positions marked. The red flags that are out on the grounds show you pretty accurately where Governor Tryon and the North Carolina militia held their decisive position here during the 2-hour battle. The blue flags, which are out on the grounds, mark the final position held by the Regulators. From recent research and archaeology that was performed, we know that from actual counts from former militiamen and Regulators that they remembered being as close as 20 and 30 yards apart, which was an ideal range for musket fire, more devastating for rifle fire, but when you consider the fact that Governor Tryon had 8 artillery pieces here, that had to be devastating. The men that he was commanding made up the militia, and in colonial North Carolina at the time, there was a colonial militia law in place, and that law stated that all able-bodied free men who fell between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to serve. But what has to be remembered about the Battle of Alamance is that even the Regulators had militia servers, because again, that was a law, a requirement. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that when Governor Tryon mustered the militia, these Regulators had to make a decision. Do we fulfill our obligations as citizens and taxpayers of his colony, or do we side with our fellow Regulators? So when they decided to stay with their fellow Regulators, they were breaking the law at that point. But some accounts make it sound like the Regulators were not as well prepared for this battle, but in all honesty, they had just as much military training as the men serving under Governor Tryon here. The determining factor in this 2-hour battle were the cannon. The governor had 2 3-pounders and 6 swivel guns. And according to his records, those artillery pieces were used for the first 30 minutes of this battle. And amazingly, these Regulators were out in the open field, standing shoulder to shoulder, just like these militiamen were. It's hard to really understand how they could stand up to the artillery as long as they did. But after that 30 minutes or so into the Battle of Alamance, they resorted to tree fighting or guerrilla warfare. And that forced Governor Tryon to at least stop using his artillery, and it forced him to order his men to pursue the Regulators into the trees. And that's the type of fighting that would continue up until around 2 o'clock on that Thursday. And that's when the mass exodus of the Regulators really started. It's hard to come up with specific numbers, at least for the Regulators. According to Governor Tryon, 9 of his men were killed, 61 wounded, and basically no matter what you read about the battle afterwards, those numbers didn't change. When it comes to Regulator casualties, the numbers range from as few as 9 to as many as 300.
Wow.
9 just doesn't seem to be realistic when you consider the fact they were standing up against artillery. So we just don't think that's feasible. We think 300 may be a little high. So somewhere in between, maybe around 100 may have died here. A few monuments out on the property. The one that's located closest to the highway was actually erected here in 1880 by residents of Alamance County. It has inscriptions on the monument stating that it was the first battle of the American Revolution. And the same inscription appears on the second monument that's located here. It was originally erected at what became Guilford Courthouse National Military Park in 1901. And it also makes that reference. We do not officially take the stance that this was the first battle of the American Revolution. And there are people who feel strongly both ways. But the main reason we don't interpret as being the first battle of the war for independence is due to the fact that the regulators were not focused on independence. That was not a concern. But the problems that they faced, the excessive taxation, lack of voice in government, was the same problems that other colonies were encountering at the time. So people in the other colonies read about what happened in North Carolina, and they heard about it from by word of mouth. But why we think this battle was so important is that it provided a very valuable lesson in the use of armed resistance, an idea or tool that revolutionaries started seriously considering to use just a few years later. Circa 1780 John Allen House, located on the property, and this is an actual log dwelling that was constructed in the 18th century. It was occupied by descendants in the John Allen family from 1780 approximately to around 1929. And sometimes that can be just as accurate as any other type of documentation.
Right.
Sometimes it can get skewed.
So here's the John Allen house.
The kitchen garden. Whether or not the Allens actually had one is not really clear, but some people did, and they enclosed their gardens inside paling fences. They wanted to keep their domestic animals out as well as the wild animals. Right. Rachel Allen, John's wife, was considered to have been a traveling doctor, and she was very knowledgeable about the uses of herbs and natural plants for making medicines and for culinary reasons. It's possible she may have had a combination vegetable and herb garden, but she could go out and identify what grew naturally.